Welcome to this rapid revision session on Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. This is a landmark Supreme Court case, and actually it's called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Who's Brown then? Well, Brown in this case is this little girl right here, Linda Brown. She was a black schoolchild in Topeka, Kansas, and she became the focus of this court case, but she actually just represents millions of other black children in America at this time. This is one of the most important court cases that you will study in this topic, and it sets a precedent for desegregation that lasts well into the 60s. Firstly, Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are the US Constitution. This is the list of the most important rights and laws that apply to all states if they're going to be part of the United States. Remember that US states can set a certain number of laws themselves. Secondly, unconstitutional. Any law or action that breaks the rules set out in the Constitution. Thirdly, the Supreme Court. This is the highest court in the USA. It decides whether the Constitution has been broken or not. Firstly then, we need to understand the situation in education and segregation in the South at this time. Did it break Plessy versus Ferguson? A reminder that in the 1950s, many black children in the South had to pass white schools that were nearer to their home in order to get to their nearest black school. Plessy versus Ferguson, remember, was the 1896 court case that suggested that segregation was constitutional as long as the facilities were equal. The phrase used was separate but equal. The inherent unequal nature of separating people based on race we'll cover in a moment. When the family of Linda Brown, pictured, challenged this, they lost because the Supreme Court said that this was in line with Plessy's separate but equal ruling. 4 other families also tried and failed. The key question then is, did the Supreme Court uphold the Constitution correctly? The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees equal protection under the laws, and supposedly the separate but equal ruling did just that. But it was going to be up to people campaigning to get segregation ended to demonstrate that the separate was inherently not equal. This is where we move on to the Supreme Court case Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. In 1952, the NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, took on all 5 school desegregation cases under the name Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. They knew that if they focused on the schools, they would lose, as states that were good at arguing that black people were being provided with an education the same as white children, and indeed, specifically in Kansas, many of the schools did have equal funding and similar facilities. Instead, they focused on the issue that black children were made to feel inferior to white children, and on this basis they were being discriminated against. And that was against the Constitution under the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the laws. It's a little bit complicated, but really what this is arguing is that the very fact that children are segregated based on race makes the black children feel inferior, and that is unequal. This is the Supreme Court as it looked in 1954. The man in the centre is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a man called Earl Warren. He had only just taken the job, and that's really important because he was against segregation, as we'll see. Just by the by, here's a more recent picture of the Supreme Court, although not quite up to date. The lady in the front row with the gold necklace there, she sadly died a couple of years ago, and therefore she needs to be replaced. And President Biden is in the process of doing that as I record this. But we can see just how much more diverse the Supreme Court is in modern times. We have people of different ethnicities, and we have a mixture of both men and women. They're all old though, and there's actually a good case for why that is. To be on the Supreme Court is a lifetime appointment. In other words, once you get the job, you either retire or, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, you die while you're still doing the job. It really does mean lifetime. It provides stability, but it means that if there is a bias politically in one way or the other, it can be very long-lasting indeed. So the appointment of Earl Warren is really significant. It helps tip the balance away from segregation and towards change. So the breakthrough here is that the Supreme Court decided to rule in favour of Brown. So the Supreme Court is made up of 9 judges. Once appointed, as I've ventured, they can keep their job for life unless they quit. In December 1952, a pro-segregation judge died. He was replaced by Earl Warren, who was not pro-segregation and ended up leading the Supreme Court. On May 17, 1954, the NAACP won the case and the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional because black children were made to feel inferior. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled that desegregation of all schools should be carried out with all deliberate speed. And that last phrase is very important. It doesn't actually lay out an exact time frame. All deliberate speed to a state that doesn't want to integrate its schools is a very different thing to all deliberate speed, meaning that it's going to happen quickly, as we shall see. So what changed then? Many white people in the South reacted with fury to the Brown decision. The more northerly border states in the South began to desegregate. Black teachers often lost their jobs, though, when the schools integrated or desegregated. In the Deep South, such as Alabama and Georgia, state government opposed change and even threatened to close schools entirely rather than desegregate. Angry white people formed white citizens' councils. Now, don't be fooled by the name. These were virtually terrorist organisations that used extreme violence to preserve segregation. Membership of the terrorist Ku Klux Klan increased as well. Groups of white parents protested outside desegregated schools and intimidated black pupils, most famously in 1957 at Little Rock. There'll be a further video on that in future. Finally, Plessy couldn't now be used to stop desegregation anymore. The Supreme Court had actually set a new precedent. Now, this is a really important bit of progress. Given that the Supreme Court have now ruled that desegregation is unconstitutional in educational settings, that means that should anyone challenge segregation in other settings, such as transport or public buildings, they should make the same judgment, that that too is unconstitutional. That's what is meant by a precedent. They are supposed to respect the earlier ruling and rule in a similar way. You might say, therefore, that Brown versus Board of Education is a turning point in the civil rights struggle, but there's going to be lots more to do. Check out that cartoon in the bottom right. If you can't read the writing, here's what it says. There's a school in the background that says James Crow Public School. That's a bit of a play on words on Jim Crow there, suggesting that school is still segregated. The little girl holding a birthday cake, who is black, says, "I'm 8. I was born on the day of the Supreme Court decision." So think about it. If the Supreme Court decision was in 1954 and she's 8, this cartoon was produced in 1962, and it's suggesting that segregation is still a reality for many people. Some final points then. Education in the South was segregated, but some districts provided an equal provision. Under the Plessy ruling of 1896, this was constitutional. The NAACP submitted the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas case to the Supreme Court. Under Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, the NAACP won the case on the basis that segregation was unequal because it made people feel inferior. The Supreme Court insisted that education integrate with all deliberate speed, which might mean quite slowly. But this set an important precedent, but the backlash was violent and little changed quickly. That's the end of this lesson. There'll be future lessons on this topic. For example, I'm going to be doing one shortly on the Little Rock 9 in 1957, which shows the difficulty of actually enforcing this decision. Nevertheless, it is an important step forward, and I hope the video has been useful to you. Thanks very much for watching, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more regular rapid revision materials. Goodbye.